He ordered her to get an abortion. She agreed. He showed up at the clinic riddled with regret, only to find she was already leaving. 8 months later, he saw her and the devastating truth hit him like a ton of bricks. What binds a man to a woman isn't love, it's obligation. That sentence was delivered with the same nonchalance as someone spreading butter on toast. It was a Tuesday night, warm and unremarkable, just like most nights in that quiet house where the only sounds were the clinking of silverware and the creaking of the rocking chair on the porch. Robert's father uttered that judgment between sips of beer and bites of steak, not even bothering to look at his son. And it was right there at that table, swallowed by the darkness of the room, that Robert understood, or maybe just accepted, that he was living a life he never chose. Rose, sitting across from him, didn't even glance up. She was used to heavy pronouncements delivered in a gentle voice. The words didn't sting her as much as they might have. They hurt, sure, but she'd already built up a thick skin. She just kept spreading butter on her bread, her eyes downcast, wondering why she even bothered anymore. Like this video, subscribe to our channel, and comment below with your first impressions. Part 1: The Space Between. They married young. The townspeople said they were in love. Some even wagered it would be one of those forever kind of loves that could weather any storm. But those who truly knew Robert, and maybe not even he himself was on that list, knew he only got married because his father decided it was time. Because Rose was a good girl from a decent family with clean hands, and way too sweet to say no. The problem was, Rose genuinely loved him. Not in some over-the-top, dramatic movie way, but in the way one loves simply because she didn't know any other way to live. She loved his silences, his reserved demeanor, even the flaws everyone else criticized. She believed that in time, his heart would finally awaken. But time doesn't awaken anything that's locked up tight. Robert, for his part, never knew what to do with Rose's love. He felt like it was too much, like it suffocated him. And he also felt a sense of guilt, not for not loving her back, but because she didn't seem to notice. When Rose would smile and say, "I made you cinnamon coffee just the way you like it," he would feel a knot tighten in his stomach. He wanted to say, "Thank you," but the words wouldn't come. He wanted to smile, but his mouth felt like stone. His love lived in the past, in a name he held onto like a burning secret under his tongue. He never had the courage to tell Rose, not because she needed to hear it. She already knew. Women always know, but she preferred to pretend she didn't. The house they lived in was simple, built with both of their father's hands. It had exposed brick walls, smelled of firewood, and had windows that let in the desert wind. But what blew inside wasn't a breeze. It was absence. Rose moved through the house as if she were dancing alone. She tended the plants on the patio, hung the sheets smelling of soap to dry, and wrote little notes that she hid in his shirt pockets. Silly notes like, "I dreamed about us at the beach today," or, "You smiled in your sleep tonight." He would read them. He would save them. But he never replied. Around town, they said he was cold. She would say he was just tired, that someday he would wake up a different person. But the days turned into weeks, then months, and he never woke up. One rainy night, everything almost changed. Rose spiked a high fever. She trembled and sweated, her eyes unfocused, her body as fragile as a wet rag. Robert ran to the town pharmacy, soaked to the bone. He came back with medicine, warm towels, and a desperate silence. He spent the night by her side, changing compresses, adjusting the blanket, murmuring things he didn't even know how to say. When the fever finally broke, she fell asleep, resting on his chest, and he didn't move a muscle. He stayed there, staring at the ceiling with the feeling that something inside him wanted to be born, but it just wouldn't. The next morning, she woke up and saw him there. She smiled with tenderness, wanting to freeze that moment in time with her eyes. He simply got up and said he had to go to work. It was as if nothing had happened. But something, yes, had happened. Something small, almost imperceptible, but real nonetheless. Still, the distance between them remained. A chasm without a bridge, only with half-hearted gestures on one side and impenetrable walls on the other. Gradually, Rose started talking less. She stopped writing the little notes. She drank her coffees alone, without offering him a sip. The silence between them grew until it became a presence in itself. It was no longer something to be avoided. It was what filled the spaces. She would look out the window, watching the tree branches dance in the wind. And she would wonder when she started living like this. When she stopped trying to be happy and started just trying to get by. Maybe it was on her wedding day. Maybe it was the first thank you he didn't say. Maybe it never even had a beginning. Robert felt the weight of expectations in his chest like a sack of sand that no one else could see. He blamed Rose for being there, for this house, for the role he was playing so poorly. But deep down, he knew the problem wasn't her. It was him. It always had been. It was just easier to place the blame than to admit it. His father always said, "A real man swallows his pain and moves on. That love is for weak people." And Robert swallowed everything. The tedium, the discomfort, the longing to disappear. He swallowed Rose. One night, he came home later than usual. He'd spent hours driving aimlessly, just trying to avoid coming back. When he walked in, he found the house dark, with only a single lamp on in the corner of the room. Rose was there, sitting on the sofa with a book on her lap that she wasn't reading. "I thought you weren't coming," she said, without anger, without reproach. "I'm here now," was all he replied. And he sat down on the other side of the room. They didn't say anything else. They just stayed there, two silent bodies, breathing slowly, as if the night could somehow heal what love couldn't. Outside, the rain fell softly. Inside, the emptiness was thick, dense, like a third inhabitant in that house. And that's how their marriage was measured. Not with promises or kisses, but with pauses. Long, painful, profound pauses, without a single word spoken. And perhaps for that very reason, they both knew something was about to change. They just didn't know what. Not yet. Part 2. The last gesture. That morning, the sky was a blank canvas, neither blue nor gray, as if the day itself had forgotten to begin. Robert left early without saying where he was going. Rose listened to the sound of the door closing with that cruel lightness of someone who has already learned to leave on the inside long before their feet walk out the door. She stayed in bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling a different kind of silence. It was no longer the silence between them. It was the silence within her, as if her body knew before her mind that something had broken beyond repair. The following days came in fragments. He started coming home later and later. Sometimes he didn't sleep at home at all. Other times he would return with the scent of another woman's skin clinging to his clothes. Rose didn't ask any questions. She had learned that certain answers weren't worth the bitter taste of the question. Until the night he didn't bother to hide it anymore. They were having dinner or trying to. Anyway, 2 plates served, 2 chairs occupied, and a chasm in the middle. He dropped his fork on the table with a dry clatter and said, "I want a divorce." Rose looked up slowly, not out of surprise, but like someone finally facing what they've always known. "I never loved you," he continued, without a flicker of emotion. "My heart always belonged to someone else." She remained still. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just took a deep breath, trying to hold her body together. Inside, the floor had crumbled beneath her. But on the outside, she simply got up from the table, took her plate, and carried it to the sink. He watched her, confused by her lack of reaction. He expected a scene. He expected guilt, but all he got was a silence that cut deeper than any words. That night, Rose didn't sleep. She sat on the porch with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders and her feet freezing cold. She looked at the empty street and wondered how it was possible that even having seen it all coming, it still hurt this much. 2 days later, the dizziness arrived. The nausea, the missed period. She knew her body had once again warned her even before the test could confirm it. But she took it anyway, alone, at a pharmacy in the center of town where no one made eye contact and everyone knew too much. Positive. She returned home with the result folded in her coat pocket. She sat on the bed, took a deep breath, and waited for him to arrive. She had to tell him. It was the least she could do. Robert came in as usual, without knocking, without even looking at her. He threw his backpack in a corner and went straight to the bathroom. When he came out, Rose was standing in the center of the room. "I'm pregnant." He froze. His eyes blinked slowly, as if his brain was refusing to process the information. "What? Pregnant?" she repeated, her voice clear. He took a step back, almost laughing with nerves. No, it can't be. You must be wrong." "I'm not." Silence, and then the explosion. "Get rid of it. I'm already leaving. I'm not sticking around for a mistake I didn't choose." She didn't move. She didn't widen her eyes in surprise. She didn't beg. She simply replied, "Okay, I'll take care of it." And it was that calm, that lack of a fight that made him sigh with relief. He thought she had understood that that was the end of it, that now he could leave with a clear conscience. But what he didn't see, what he never saw, was that behind that calm was something else. There was a plan, or rather, there was something growing inside her, something he would never understand. Part 3. The author of her own story. In the following days, Rose pretended to go on with her life. She cleaned the house, took short walks on the town's trails, and avoided the neighbors. Some looked at her with curiosity, others with pity. She just smiled without showing her teeth. She carried the secret like someone carries a knife in their pocket. Cold, sharp, necessary. Robert started going out even more, and when he was home, he remained silent. He spent more time with his phone than with his eyes on her. And still Rose watched him. Every gesture, every hesitation, every new line of weariness etched on his face. One night they sat at the dinner table in silence, as always. But something hung heavy in the air. "Have you talked to a lawyer yet?" she asked, without looking up. "Not yet. But I will," he replied dryly. "When you want me to sign. Let me know." She nodded, and she went back to staring at her plate. But she didn't eat. She just pushed her food around, like someone searching for something that was never there. Later, lying in bed, Rose caressed her own belly, still flat, still invisible. She thought about what would become of that baby. She thought about how to protect something so fragile in a world where no one holds anything with both hands. She still didn't know exactly what she was going to do. She just knew what she wasn't going to do. The next morning, while he was still asleep, she wrote something on the bathroom mirror with lipstick. "I wish you peace, even if it's not with me." And then she went for a walk. At the town market, she saw a middle-aged woman with a child in her arms. He was laughing, covered in flour, and hugged his mother, his little feet dangling. Rose couldn't look away. She felt like crying, but she didn't. When she returned home, Robert was already gone. In the kitchen, his mug was still on the counter with the remains of cold coffee. She washed it with slow, almost delicate movements, as if by cleaning it, she could somehow erase everything that hurt. Later, she sat at the table and began to write, not letters, not goodbyes. She was writing plans. She was thinking about routes, about names, about what it would be like to run away, not out of fear, but out of love. A love that was now only hers, and that being who was growing silently, protecting her from within. And that night, as she lay down, she looked at the dark ceiling and whispered, "You don't need anyone else. I have you, and that's enough." On the other side of the city, Robert was drinking with friends who didn't really know him, with women who didn't truly want him. He laughed loudly, as if the world was simple, as if everything was fine. But deep down, there was something strange, an echo, an annoyance, an emptiness that no drink could fill. He didn't know yet that the biggest lie in the whole story was about to begin, and that for the first time in his life, Rose wasn't the victim. She's the author, and like any author of a story, she no longer wanted to live someone else's. Rose took an invisible pen and began to rewrite her destiny with trembling but firm hands. In the early morning hours, before the first rooster crowed, she left town without a sound. She carried with her a small suitcase, the pregnancy tests hidden among her cotton clothes, and the last photograph of their wedding, not out of nostalgia, but as a reminder of what would never be again. The bus departed, its headlights slicing through the darkness. Rose didn't look back, not out of strength, but out of weariness. Behind her, she left a house where love had never truly entered. Through the bus's foggy window, she saw the outlines of the hills fading into the mist, as if the world she was leaving behind was slowly being erased. Her destination was a small, isolated village in the New Mexico desert. Mrs. Gomez, her maternal grandmother, lived there, a woman with small eyes and a firm voice, who wore every year she had lived as a badge of wisdom on her face. Rose didn't call ahead. She just showed up. When Mrs. Gomez opened the door, she said nothing. She just looked at her granddaughter, her swollen eyes, and the silence clinging to her skin, and she understood everything. She let her in, pointed to the bed in the back room, and went back to sewing, as if it were any other day. Because women like her didn't make a fuss. They offered refuge. The first day passed without questions. The second one, too. It was only on the third day, as they sorted corn for the chickens, that her grandmother spoke. If you're hungry, eat. If you want to cry, cry. But don't live with all that locked inside. Rose bit her lip. She didn't reply. She kept shelling the corn until her fingers burned. It was easier to feel physical pain than to speak. Time in that village had a different rhythm. There was no internet, no rush, no awkward stares, just dry land, a heavy wind, and barefoot children running on dirt roads. Rose started dressing like the local women. Wide skirts, cotton blouses, and her hair always tied back. It was an attempt to disappear. At the small health clinic, a soft-spoken nurse listened to the baby's heartbeat for the first time. Rose closed her eyes. It was a dull, strong, undeniable drumbeat. She cried in silence, her head resting on the worn bed sheet of the examining table, not out of sadness, but because in that sound, there was life, and she needed to start over. The lie came from a nosy neighbor. "You look like you've been a mother before." Rose hesitated but replied, "I was, but I lost him." The lie hurt, but it also protected. The news spread quickly. Soon, everyone believed she was there recovering from a loss. And yes, she was just not the one they thought. In the days that followed, Rose helped her grandmother with sewing, tended the plants, and read books that had been gathering dust on the shelves for years. She wrote letters she never sent, jotted down possible names for the baby, and practiced smiling in front of the mirror. She was relearning how to exist. At night, on the porch with her feet up on an old cushion, she would listen to her grandmother murmur prayers and felt that perhaps for the first time, she was safe. "You don't need to run," Mrs. Gomez said one of those nights, sewing a sky-blue blanket with infinite patience. "But you can't hide forever either." Rose looked down, hugging her still discreet belly. "I'm not hiding. I'm waiting to be strong." Strength isn't something you wait for, mija. It's something you create. That sentence echoed for days. In the village, she met Letitia, a middle-aged woman with 2 children and a painful past she didn't hide. They became friends of silence, the kind who understand each other with glances and share secrets without naming them. It was Letitia who, one afternoon, asked point blank, "If he changed, would you forgive him?" Rose didn't hesitate. Forgiving isn't the hard part. The hard part is learning to trust again. And that was the point. Trust can't be mended with apologies. It's like glass. And broken glass can't be mended with thread. Time went on as if it were trying to heal. But Rose knew there was no cure. There was only choice. And she chose to move forward. Then came the day she scheduled the appointment. Not because she wanted to, but because she needed to feel that she was in control, that she was the one making the decisions. The day before, she stayed awake, her eyes fixed on the ceiling and her hand on her belly. She talked to the baby without words, only with thoughts. It was as if she were saying, "If you're going to be born into a world where no one wants you, it's better that it's not now." But her heart was beating strongly, insistently, as if it were saying, "I'm here, and I want you." That same night, on the other side of the city, Robert dreamed. In his dream, Rose was leaving a sterile, white clinic. Her hands were stained with blood, her eyes empty, and there was a strange sound, not a scream, not silence. It was a cry, a baby's cry. He woke up drenched in sweat, his chest pounding as if he had run miles. And for the first time he felt fear. Without thinking, he got in the car. He drove without stopping, as if the wheels knew the way. He arrived at the clinic just as dawn was breaking. The street was empty. A cold wind blew, kicking up dust. And then he saw her. Rose was coming out slowly, her steps heavy, her face downcast, her head low. He ran toward her. "Rose." She stopped, but she didn't look at him. "It's done. I got rid of it." The sentence was delivered like a knife, without hesitation, without drama. Just said. He looked at her, his mouth opening and closing without making a sound. "You don't have to worry anymore." And she kept walking. He fell to his knees right there on the dirty sidewalk. The world spun. Everything in him screamed, "No!" But it was too late. Or at least that's what he believed. What he never knew was that she hadn't done anything. She had just decided not to share anything else with someone who never stayed. That lie was the last gesture of love, or perhaps of self-preservation, because she knew that from that moment on, what she carried inside was only hers and whoever was willing to stay. Part 3. The Return of the Prodigal Son. Back at the house after seeing her leave the clinic, or believing he saw her leave with an empty womb and a shattered soul, Robert carried a weight he couldn't immediately name. For the first few days, he tried to act as if nothing had happened. He talked to friends, laughed at the same jokes, went out drinking. But there was something off about everything. A dull sound behind the music. A lack of flavor in the drinks. An inability to laugh that he couldn't explain. The house, once silent, now screamed at him. The objects weren't just there. They judged him. The teapot, the old curtains she washed every week, the blue blanket folded on the sofa. Everything was a memory of what he never knew how to appreciate. Robert walked through the rooms like someone walking through ruins. And no matter how much he tried to convince himself that he was free now, something inside him knew he had lost something bigger than any freedom. He started avoiding the mirror. His own eyes accused him. There was something he didn't recognize. Unease. One night, as he opened the nightstand drawer looking for a sleeping pill, he found the little notes, the ones Rose used to leave in his pockets, among his clothes, or taped to his notebooks. He had read them at the time, yes, but he never gave them any real thought. Now each sentence was a dagger. "You smiled in your sleep last night. I watched you for hours. You looked happy. I made you cinnamon coffee. I know you prefer it strong, but today I felt like you needed something sweet." And then, at the bottom of the drawer, folded into quarters like someone hiding a piece of their soul, was the final note. "If you ever truly love me, I hope there's still time." He read it aloud once, twice, 3 times. And then he broke. It wasn't a pretty cry. It was a collapse. His body curled up on the floor, his sobs muffled, his hands shaking, his throat burning. He cried like someone who never learned how, like someone who had always suppressed everything and could no longer. That night he understood, truly understood, what he had done. It wasn't just about asking for a divorce. It wasn't just about the rejected pregnancy. It was about all the days she tried, all the days she insisted. And he walked away. The regret didn't arrive as a thought. It arrived as a presence. A weight on the back of his neck, an echo in the walls, a voice that repeated, "She stayed, and you left." His friends disappeared, not out of malice, but because they didn't know how to deal with who he had become. Robert was no longer the same. He didn't drink as much. He didn't laugh the same way. He had a lost. Okay, here is the rewritten version of the provided text, translated and expanded upon to embody the requested style and tone. He was always looking, forever searching for something irretrievable, something no one could ever give back to him. One day, driven by some unseen force, he found himself wandering back to the park, that familiar place where he and Rose used to stroll hand in hand. He settled onto her favorite bench, the one nestled beneath the sprawling tree, its leaves now tinged with the hues of rust and decay. He remained there for what felt like an eternity, just watching the endless parade of people passing by. A young couple ambled past, pushing a baby stroller, and he found himself unable to tear his gaze away. A silent, aching thought echoed in his mind. Asterisk, that could have been me. That should have been me. Asterisk, but it wasn't. The reality was stark and undeniable. He eventually made his way back home, the silence of the empty house pressing in on him. He pulled out the old photo albums, their covers coated in a layer of dust, relics of a happier past. He stopped at a particular image, a snapshot of the two of them dancing at a wedding. Rose was radiant, her eyes sparkling with genuine joy. He, on the other hand, was just there, a mere presence, a shadow in the background. For the first time, a painful realization dawned on him. He had never truly smiled in any of those photos with her. He sank to the living room floor, surrounded by the scattered albums, the forgotten notes, the faded memories he had so carelessly ignored for so long. And in that moment, clarity struck him, a clarity that felt like a physical blow. He had lost Rose long before he even realized how much he had her, how deeply she was woven into the fabric of his being. In the days that followed, he desperately tried to reach her, to bridge the gap he had created. He dialed her number, only to be met with a cold, impersonal recording. Asterisk, this number is no longer in service. Asterisk, he then called Rose's mother, hoping for some semblance of connection. But she hung up without uttering a single word, the silence deafening. He sent countless messages, pouring his heart out in digital form, but they remained unanswered, lost in the digital ether. He even drove to her parents' house, a place that once felt like a second home, but no one answered the door. He later learned that they had sold the house, severing all ties to the past, and moved away, leaving no forwarding address. Rose had become an absence, a void in his life that seemed to grow larger with each passing day. Robert desperately tried to cobble together some semblance of normalcy, to pretend that everything was all right, even though his world had crumbled around him. He took a job at a mechanic shop, immersing himself in the gritty, oily world of engines and tools. He spent his days covered in grease and grime, trying to get his hands as dirty as possible, hoping that the physical labor would somehow cleanse his soul, prevent it from becoming even more tainted. At night, he refused the comfort of his bed, choosing instead to sleep on the sofa, not for comfort, but as a form of self-imposed punishment. The dreams of Rose intensified, becoming more vivid and more haunting. Sometimes, she would simply look at him in silence, her eyes filled with an unspoken sadness. Other times, she would speak, her voice barely a whisper, her eyes brimming with tears. And in some of the most agonizing dreams, she would hand him a baby, a child that was undeniably theirs, only to snatch it away before he could even hold it, leaving him with an empty embrace and a heart filled with despair. Loneliness became his constant companion, not the kind of loneliness that one chooses, but the kind that is brutally imposed upon you, a suffocating solitude that he couldn't escape. One afternoon, as he trudged home from work, his body weary and his spirit broken, he found a letter lying on his doorstep. There was no return address, no sender listed, just his name scrawled across the envelope in a familiar hand. It was her handwriting, the handwriting he knew so well, the handwriting that still held a piece of his heart. He opened it with trembling hands, his breath catching in his throat. But it wasn't a new letter, not the heartfelt message he had desperately hoped for. It was an old note, one she must have accidentally left behind in a notebook he had carelessly thrown away, a relic from a time when their lives were still intertwined. Someone, by some incredible stroke of chance, had found it and returned it to him. The note contained only a few lines. Asterisk, I saw you sleeping last night. You were dreaming. Were your lips moving? Saying my name? I want to believe you were. The words hit him like a physical blow, shattering the fragile composure he had managed to build. He broke all over again, the pain as raw and intense as the day she left. The next day, driven by a desperate need for change, he decided to clean the house, to scrub away the lingering scent of her presence. It was as if he wanted to erase the smell of his own omissions, the trace of his cowardice. He threw away anything he didn't absolutely need, purging his life of unnecessary clutter. He carefully placed the notes, the memories, the fragments of their shared past into a box, sealed it shut, and hid it away in the darkest corner of the attic. But he couldn't bring himself to get rid of anything that had belonged to her. Even the lingering scent of her shampoo still clung to the pillow, a ghost of her presence. And sometimes, in moments of weakness, he would rest his face against it, burying his face in the fabric, like someone desperately seeking a safe haven, a place where he could still feel her close. Regret had become a living entity inside him, a constant presence that consumed him from the inside out, took up space, crowding out any possibility of joy or happiness. It spoke to him in whispers, reminding him of his failures. It prevented him from smiling, casting a shadow over every aspect of his life. There wasn't a single gesture, a single moment of the day that didn't trigger a memory of Rose, a reminder of what he had lost. And the cruelest part of it all was knowing that he couldn't go back, that she was no longer where he had left her. And even more agonizing, perhaps she wasn't waiting for him anymore. Robert then began to write, not letters, because he didn't know where to send them, but loose texts, fragmented outpourings of his soul, raw and unfiltered emotions spilled onto the page. Asterisk today, I saw a woman with a child in her arms. They were laughing, their joy echoing through the air. I thought, that could have been you. That could have been us. But it's not. I killed that possibility and I'm still alive. That's the worst part. He wrote without stopping, pouring out his pain, his regret, his longing onto the page. Sometimes he would read aloud to the empty room, his voice cracking with emotion. Other times, he would tear up the pages immediately after writing them, as if by writing he were trying to exorcise a ghost, a phantom he himself had created. One night, consumed by restlessness, he wandered out into the city with no particular destination in mind. He walked down unknown streets, crossed bridges that spanned the dark river, and navigated the bustling avenues. He only stopped when his body could no longer carry him, when his legs threatened to buckle beneath him. He collapsed onto a curb, the hard concrete pressing against his skin, and he cried again, the tears flowing freely down his face. No matter how many times he had cried, it always felt like the first, the pain as fresh and as searing as ever. And it was there, hunched over with his face buried in his hands, that he finally understood. It wasn't just about Rose, about losing the woman he loved. It was about him, about the man he had become, the man he had always been. The man who didn't know how to love, who was afraid to open his heart. The boy who grew up hearing that feeling was a weakness, a vulnerability to be avoided at all costs. The husband who didn't learn how to stay, who ran away from commitment and intimacy. And now, there was nowhere left to hide, no excuses to be made, no blame to be shifted. He was forced to confront the truth about himself, to acknowledge his own failings and shortcomings. That morning, upon returning home, his body exhausted but his mind strangely clear, he made a decision to start over, to rebuild his life from the ashes. Not for her, not out of guilt or regret, but for himself, because he desperately needed to heal, to repair the damage he had inflicted upon himself. But the emptiness, the void that Rose had left behind, that wouldn't go away. Because when someone leaves, leaving love and silence in the same place, there is no cure, no magic potion that can erase the pain. There is only coexistence, a learning to live with the absence, to carry the weight of what was lost. And that was what Robert was slowly learning, painstakingly learning. To coexist with a love that came too late, a realization that arrived only after the opportunity had passed. Time, as always, had that cruel habit of teaching its most important lessons when there were no more exams to take, no more chances to prove what he had learned. Part 4. In the months that followed, Robert began to change. Not like someone desperately seeking redemption, not like someone trying to earn forgiveness, but like someone who finally understood the magnitude of what they had lost, the true value of the love they had thrown away. His routine became quieter, more deliberate, more contained. There was no longer any sense of rush or distraction, no frantic attempt to fill the void. The mechanic shop became his sanctuary, the only place where his mind could find a moment of peace. Hammering, tightening screws, fixing what was broken. It was ironic, he thought. He could fix anything but his own life. One afternoon, under a sky the color of a sad, washed-out blue, with the busy streets of Phoenix pulsing around him, Robert found himself walking aimlessly, drawn by some unseen force. He had left work early, taken a different route, and ended up in a town square whose name he didn't even know. There was an old fountain in the center of the square, its water trickling gently. Stone benches lined the perimeter, offering respite to weary travelers. Ice cream vendors hawked their sweet wares, and families were spread out on the dry grass, enjoying the fleeting moments of sunshine. It was an ordinary place, a common scene, a tableau repeated in countless towns and cities across the country. But that day, in that ordinary place, everything stopped. He saw her across the street. Rose. She wore a loose-fitting blouse, but not loose enough to completely conceal the gentle curve of her belly, which she cradled with both delicacy and firmness. She walked slowly, deliberately, one hand resting on her lower back, the other protectively covering her stomach. She wore a simple dress and flat sandals, her hair tied back in a way he had never seen before, pulled away from her face to reveal the delicate lines of her jaw. But it was her. There was no mistaking it. The years had etched new lines on her face, but the essence of Rose, the woman he had loved and lost, was still there, shining through. The city continued to move around him, oblivious to the seismic shift that was occurring in his world. People walked by, their faces etched with the mundane concerns of daily life. Cars honked impatiently, their drivers eager to reach their destinations. Children laughed and shrieked with joy, their voices echoing through the square. But for Robert, everything fell silent. The world lost its sound, its color, its movement. Only that image existed, burned into his retina, seared into his soul. Rose, the woman he thought he had lost forever, standing across the street. And more than that, the truth she had never told him, the secret she had carried alone for so long. The baby. Their baby. He took a step, drawn towards her as if by an invisible force. Then another, and another, and then he stopped, rooted to the spot, unable to move any further. The impact of seeing her was stronger than any impulse, any desire, any need. It wasn't just surprise, although that was certainly there, a jolt of disbelief that ran through his veins. It was a pang in his chest, a sharp, agonizing pain that radiated outwards, encompassing his entire being. And it was a regret, a profound and devastating regret that now had flesh, form, and movement, a living embodiment of his past mistakes. He felt his legs falter beneath him, threatening to give way. He gasped for air, his lungs struggling to draw breath. His eyes filled with tears, blurring his vision, distorting the image of Rose standing across the street. And then he sank down onto the curb, not even noticing the hard concrete beneath him. His head bowed, his elbows resting on his knees, his body racked with sobs. There, amidst the cacophony of the city and the deafening silence within his own mind, he murmured, the words barely audible above the noise. She lied. She didn't have an abortion. She protected me even from that. And he cried again, the tears flowing freely, but differently this time. Because now, there was something more than guilt, more than regret, more than self-pity. There was hope, a fragile flicker of light in the darkness. Rose crossed the square without seeing him, completely unaware of his presence. She went into a bakery, her movements slow and deliberate. She bought a loaf of bread, its aroma filling the air. She talked to the saleswoman, exchanging a few brief words, smiling slightly, and then she left, carrying her precious cargo. As she walked by again, he didn't move, didn't speak, didn't even breathe. He just watched her, his eyes following her every move. She seemed tired, yes, but also whole, complete, somehow untouched by the pain and turmoil of the past. There was a fierce calm in her posture, a quiet strength in her demeanor, like someone who had fallen, but had made the conscious choice to get back up, to keep moving forward, to face whatever challenges life threw her way. That night, Robert didn't sleep. He sat on the edge of the bed, his body tense, his mind racing, his eyes fixed on the darkness outside the window. He replayed the image of Rose in his mind, scrutinizing every detail, searching for some clue, some sign, some indication of what the future might hold. And at some point, his mind conjured up an image, a vivid and emotionally charged vision of himself holding the baby in his arms. The child looked at him with deep, knowing eyes that were so much like Rose's. And in the dream, he spoke to the child, his voice filled with remorse. "I'm sorry," he said, "not just for before, but for not being better, for not being the man you deserved." He woke up in a cold sweat, his heart pounding in his chest, but with a sense of clarity, a newfound purpose that had been missing from his life for so long, like someone who had received a mission, a divine calling. He needed to see her for real, not just catch a fleeting glimpse of her on the street, like a mere spectator in her life. He needed to be in front of her, to look her in the eyes, and to say everything that was stuck inside him, all the unspoken words, all the buried emotions, even if she didn't forgive him, even if she didn't want to listen. He knew he couldn't show up empty-handed, with nothing but cheap words and empty promises. He needed to offer her something tangible, something that demonstrated his commitment, his sincerity, his willingness to change. The next morning, he asked his boss for 2 days off, fabricating a story about having to resolve some personal issues. He didn't elaborate, and his boss, sensing the urgency in his voice, didn't press him for details. He took a bus toward New Mexico, his destination the small village where Rose's mother lived. He didn't know if she was still there, if Rose had returned to her childhood home, but it was the only lead he had, the only thread he could grasp. The road to the village seemed longer than it actually was, each mile stretching out into an eternity. Every curve in the road was a memory, a flashback to their past. Every stop was a hypothesis, a mental rehearsal of what he would say when he finally stood before her. He arrived at dusk, the sun slowly sinking behind the jagged silhouette of the desert mountains, casting long shadows across the landscape. The village was still simple, quiet, unchanged, like a place that held onto everyone's secrets, a repository of forgotten dreams and unfulfilled promises. He asked for Mrs. Gomez, Rose's mother. A child, her face smudged with dirt, pointed towards a small house with a weathered roof, its paint peeling and cracked. Robert stopped in front of the wooden gate, his heart pounding against his chest like a trapped bird. He took a deep breath, trying to calm his racing pulse, to steady his trembling hands. He knocked on the gate, the sound echoing through the quiet evening air. And then he waited, his entire future hanging in the balance. The gate creaked open, the hinges protesting with a mournful groan. It wasn't Rose who answered the door. It was Mrs. Gomez, her face etched with a mixture of surprise and suspicion. Her eyes, small and sharp, scanned Robert from head to toe, like someone examining a wounded animal that had returned to the wilderness where it was born, assessing its strength, its vulnerability, its potential for causing further harm. She said nothing at first, her silence adding to his anxiety. She just opened the door a little wider, as if reluctantly granting him access to her domain. "Come in," she said finally, her voice gruff but not unkind. He obeyed, his steps slow and hesitant. He crossed the packed dirt patio, where flowers grew in a wild and untamed profusion, their colors vibrant against the arid landscape. The air was filled with the scent of earth, of freshly made tortillas, and a thick, heavy silence that hung between them like a shroud. "Rose doesn't want you here," she said, already in the kitchen, stirring something over the fire, her back to him. Robert stood still, his hands trembling, his throat dry. "I know," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "But still, I had to come." Mrs. Gomez didn't turn around. "Why?" she asked, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. "Because now," he said, struggling to find the words to express the depth of his remorse. "Now I understand. And I didn't come to promise anything, to make excuses, to beg for forgiveness. I just want to be here, to do whatever she allows, to help in any way I can." The old woman let out a sigh, a long, drawn-out exhalation that sounded more like a tired whisper than an expression of emotion. "You want to change?" she asked, finally turning to face him, her eyes piercing. He nodded, his eyes downcast, unable to meet her gaze. Then she put the wooden spoon down on the counter, crossed her arms, and looked him directly in the face with the hardness of someone who has seen too many men promise what they never deliver, who has witnessed too much heartbreak and disappointment in her life. "Then stay," she said, her voice firm, unwavering. "But no romance, no promises, just presence. Rose doesn't need a man. She needs help. And the baby needs a father." Those words hit him like a brand, searing themselves into his soul. A calling, a sentence, a path laid out before him. That same night, Mrs. Gomez prepared the back room for him. A small, Spartan space with whitewashed walls and a single window that looked out onto the desert. It was narrow, with a single bed and a closet that smelled of old wood and mothballs. But it was a beginning, and he accepted it with humility, grateful for the opportunity to even be there, to be close to Rose and his child. The next day at 6 o'clock in the morning, he heard footsteps in the kitchen, the rhythmic padding of bare feet on the tile floor. He got up before the sun had even begun to warm the tiles and went to investigate. Rose was standing with her back to him, stirring a pot on the stove, wearing an apron stained with flour and a weariness that seemed to seep into her very bones. She didn't say, "Good morning." She didn't turn around to acknowledge his presence. She just spoke dryly, her voice devoid of warmth. "You don't have to pretend everything is okay," she said, her words sharp and brittle. "I didn't come to pretend anything," he replied in a low voice, his heart aching at the distance between them. She kept stirring the pot, her movements deliberate and precise. "How long are you going to stay?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "As long as you let me," he said, his eyes fixed on her back, willing her to turn around, to look at him, to acknowledge him. She stopped stirring the pot, her body frozen in place. She took a deep breath, as if gathering her strength. Then she went back to stirring, the spoon clanging against the metal. She didn't say anything else, leaving the question hanging in the air between them. And so it went for days, a silent, tense, but strangely respectful coexistence. Robert started helping with the small things, the mundane tasks that kept the household running. First, he cleaned the patio, sweeping away the dust and leaves. Then he started going to the market, carrying the heavy bags of groceries. He took care of the chicken coop, feeding the hens and collecting the eggs. He changed the water for the plants, watering them with care. He prepared buckets of warm water when Rose's back hurt, easing her discomfort with gentle compresses. He learned to make cinnamon tea the way Mrs. Gomez had taught him, carefully measuring the spices and simmering it to perfection. He watched in silence, observing Rose, studying her movements, learning her habits. He paid attention to the small details, the things he had overlooked before, the things that truly mattered. One day, he saw Rose trying to reach something on a high shelf, stretching her arms, huffing with frustration, and continuing to try. He approached her slowly, cautiously, not wanting to startle her. "Can I?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. She hesitated, her body tense. And then, for the first time since he had arrived, she looked him directly in the eyes, her gaze searching, assessing. "Only if you ask permission," she said, her voice laced with a hint of defiance. He took a deep breath, trying to control his racing heart. "Can I help you, Rose?" he asked, his voice sincere, his eyes pleading. She looked away, breaking eye contact, and slowly, reluctantly, she took a step to the side, granting him access to her space. It was just a jar of flour, a simple, insignificant object. But for him, it was a world, a universe of possibilities, a chance to prove himself, to earn her trust, to begin to rebuild what he had so carelessly destroyed. Time passed, marked by the changing seasons, the slow rhythm of rural life. The days were long, filled with hard work and quiet contemplation. But something was changing, something subtle, almost imperceptible. Even though no one named it, no one dared to speak it aloud. One hot afternoon, while Mrs. Gomez was taking a nap in the hammock, swaying gently in the breeze, and Rose was resting with her feet propped up on a stool, trying to ease the swelling in her ankles, Robert was fighting with the patio spigot, his brow furrowed in concentration. The water pressure was low, sputtering and splashing everywhere, soaking his clothes. He was muttering curses under his breath, his frustration mounting. "Damn it!" he exclaimed, his voice barely above a whisper. "All that's missing is for this thing to explode now." Rose heard him, her ears pricking up at the sound of his voice. And for the first time since he had returned, she let out a laugh, a brief, spontaneous burst of amusement that echoed through the courtyard. He turned, surprised by the sound, his eyes searching hers. And she looked away, her cheeks flushed, her expression guarded, like someone who has been caught off guard by an affection she didn't want to admit, a warmth she had tried to suppress. "What was that?" he risked asking, his voice hesitant. "Nothing," she said quickly, her eyes darting away. "It's just, you haven't changed that much." He smiled, not knowing if that was a good thing or a bad thing, but recognizing it as a sign. A crack in the wall she had built around her heart. In her room, on top of the wooden crib, there was a teddy bear, worn and faded with age. The same one from the beginning of their marriage, which he had once brought her without thinking, in a gesture that was too small, too insignificant for what was missing between them, for the love he had failed to express. Now, that little bear was there, a silent witness to a time that no longer existed, a reminder of what they had once shared. One day, while Rose was folding the baby's clothes, her movements slow and deliberate, he came into the room slowly, cautiously, as if entering a sacred space. "Can I?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She didn't reply, didn't acknowledge his presence, but she didn't send him away either, allowing him to remain. He approached the crib, his gaze drawn to the tiny clothes, the miniature socks and hats, the delicate fabric that would soon be touching his child's skin. He carefully touched the little bear, his fingers tracing the worn fabric, remembering the day he had given it to her. Then he looked at her, his eyes filled with remorse, with longing, with a desperate desire to turn back time. "I wish I could go back," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Do everything differently." She stopped folding the clothes, her hands still. She looked at him, her gaze unwavering. There were tears in her eyes, but also firmness, a quiet strength that he had come to admire. "But you can't," she said, her voice soft but resolute. "I know," he said, his head bowed. "And it doesn't do any good for you to tell me you've changed," she continued, her voice laced with a hint of bitterness. "I don't want to hear it. I need to see it, to feel it, to know that it's real." He nodded, his heart filled with a mixture of hope and despair. "That's what I'm trying to do," he said, his voice sincere. The silence between them was no longer a chasm, a vast and unbridgeable gulf of pain and resentment. It was a bridge under construction, slow, unsure, but real, a fragile connection being built one small step at a time. The weeks passed, each day a testament to his commitment, his patience, his willingness to change. Robert was still there, present, silent, firm, a constant presence in her life. And Rose, little by little, began to breathe differently, to relax her guard, to allow herself to feel, to hope, to believe that maybe, just maybe, things could be different this time. Still with fear, still with reservations, still with the weight of the past hanging over her. But something in her was also changing, thawing, softening. Because love, sometimes, doesn't come back, doesn't simply reappear after a long absence. It is reborn from scratch in a different way, shaped by the experiences, the scars, the lessons learned. And no one there was in a hurry, no one pushing, no one demanding. Because when pieces are glued back together carefully, with patience and precision, they form something stronger than before, something more resilient, something more beautiful. Even if they are never quite the same. Part 5. A new kind of family. In that early morning, time seemed to go off-kilter, twisting and distorting, losing its normal rhythm. The house was dark, the air still and heavy with the silence of sleep. The whole world was sleeping, or so it seemed, except for her. Rose's cry was dry, intense, and it went through the walls like a muffled thunder, jolting everyone awake. Robert, who had been sleeping lightly ever since he moved into the small back room. His senses always on high alert, jumped out of bed as if he were under attack, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't even bother to put on his shoes, his bare feet slapping against the cold tile floor. He ran through the house, his eyes burning with adrenaline, his heart out of rhythm, his mind racing with fear. He found her hunched over in the hallway, her body contorted with pain, holding her belly with both hands, her face slick with a cold sweat. "Rose," he cried, his voice filled with panic, rushing towards her. "It's coming now," she muttered between her teeth, her voice ragged and strained with pain, barely audible above the sound of her own labored breathing. "The baby's coming." He didn't hesitate, didn't question, didn't waste a single second. He grabbed the keys from the hook by the door, opened the front gate, and started the car, his movements swift and efficient, born of desperation. He didn't even bother to turn on the headlights, his only focus on getting her to the hospital as quickly as possible. Mrs. Gomez was already standing, too, her eyes wide and alert, as if she had known beforehand, as if she had been expecting this moment all along. She just handed him the hospital bag without a word, her face a mask of grim determination. Robert ran back to Rose and helped her into the car, his arms supporting her weight. No one said anything, their silence filled with a shared sense of urgency, of fear, of hope. The road to the hospital was like crossing a minefield, a treacherous path filled with obstacles and hidden dangers. Potholes, stones, curves, each one a potential threat, each one a reminder of the fragility of life. And in the passenger seat, beside him, was the woman he had once sworn not to love, the woman he had pushed away, the woman he had hurt so deeply, and who was now the only person he wanted to see breathe, the only person whose well-being mattered more than his own. "Breathe with me, Rose," he said, his voice soft and soothing. "Come on, breathe deep, in and out. I know what I have to do. I'm here. Just drive," she said through clenched teeth, her voice barely a whisper. "Just get me there." And he drove, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly, his eyes focused on the road ahead, his heart filled with a prayer. He drove with the care of someone carrying something sacred, something infinitely precious. At the hospital, the hallway smelled of disinfectant and urgency, a sterile environment filled with the hushed voices of doctors and nurses, the beeping of machines, the ever-present sense of life and death hanging in the balance. Doctors ran back and forth, their faces etched with concern, their movements hurried and efficient, and he felt his legs giving way beneath him as they put her in a wheelchair, his body trembling with a mixture of fear and exhaustion. "Are you the father?" they asked, their voices impersonal, their eyes focused on Rose. He hesitated for a second, his mind racing, his past mistakes flashing before his eyes. But not to think, not to question, only to let the weight of the words settle in, to allow himself to embrace the reality of the moment. "Yes, I am," he said, his voice firm and clear, filled with a newfound sense of purpose. He was allowed to enter the delivery room, to be by her side, to offer her his support. He stayed by her side, holding her hand tightly, his fingers intertwined with hers. She, between contractions, squeezed his hand with such intensity that his fingers throbbed with pain. But he didn't let go, didn't flinch, didn't even consider releasing his grip. "Rose," he murmured, his voice soft and soothing, trying to reassure her, to offer her comfort. She didn't answer, her face contorted with pain. But she didn't let go either, her grip as tight as his. The hours. He held it out to her. Inside a small cardboard box, nestled a simple ring. No stones, no flash, just pure, carefully chosen, and paid for with countless hours of hard work and sacrificed evenings. "Rose," he began, "I was such a fool. I loved you from the very beginning, but I was too blind and stupid to see it." His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed his nervousness. She simply gazed at him, speechless. Their little girl remained asleep, her soft breaths filling the air as if everything in the world was just as it should be. "You are my home, Rose, you are my courage. Will you marry me again? This time only for love." just for love. Time seemed to freeze. Rose glanced at their daughter, then back at Robert, her eyes shimmering with tears not of sorrow, but of overwhelming joy. She hesitated for a moment, knowing the weight of the word she was about to utter. It signified a fresh start, not forgetting the past, but viewing it as a reminder of the journey that had brought them to this very place. Yes, she whispered. Now, yes. Robert closed his eyes briefly, as if exhaling a long-held breath of relief, like a weary traveler finally finding shelter from the storm. In the shadows of the patio, concealed amongst the plants, Mrs. Gomez stood watching. She didn't intrude, didn't want to interrupt their moment. She simply smiled. A gentle, knowing smile from someone who understood that some harvests require patience, but that they always eventually blossom. Now a real family, she murmured to herself, her heart filled with warmth as she quietly retreated back inside. On the porch, the moon appeared to bear witness to everything. And there, beneath a vast sky teeming with unseen observers, 3 lives became interwoven, not with empty promises, but with meaningful actions, with the profound weight of their shared history, and the delicate lightness of all the possibilities that still lay ahead. Their love now was no longer some distant dream. It was an everyday reality. True love doesn't always start with grand declarations. Sometimes, it begins with stumbles, with uncomfortable silences, with hidden wounds that no one else sees, but also with deliberate choices, with someone who, despite everything, chooses to stay. Because to truly love is not just about what you say, it's about how you care. It's about truly listening. It's about returning and earning the right to stay. And sometimes, what begins with such pain and hardship ends with a sweet baby sleeping peacefully in your arms and a heart that finally understands what it means to truly, deeply love. If you've stayed with this story until the very end, let me know you were here with me. Leave a comment and simply say, I stayed, because those who stay until the very end understand the true value of a new beginning.